Morning. Allison, thank you for reading that. It's one of my favorite things, and I must admit that preaching on this Sunday, I am a little frightened. With all the suffering in the world, it just feels like Lent. The period in which we usually celebrate the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth, the ways he tried to offer goodness to this world, and the ways this world has routinely refused goodness as a choice. At Calvary, we have been exploring the appointed Bible readings each week and conversation with the 8 pillars of joy, as outlined in the conversation called the Book of Joy, where Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama discuss very profound things. So a big welcome to you if you're joining us for the first time. Welcome to this caravan as we travel from mourning to dancing, and yes, there will be dancing. Today's lesson is acceptance. The Book of Joy defines acceptance as a spiritual practice using these words. So many of the causes of suffering come from our reacting to people, to places and things and circumstances in our lives, rather than just accepting them. When we react, we stay locked in judgment and in criticism, anxiety and despair, even denial and addiction. It is impossible to experience joy when we are stuck in this way. Acceptance is the sword that cuts through all this resistance, allowing us to relax, to see clearly, and to make appropriate responses. By worshiping together today remotely, we are practicing a kind of acceptance. We accept the reality of COVID-19. We have not given up. We have not gone to get our affairs in order. We are not wallowing in despair. In fact, the spiritual practice of acceptance is the opposite of resignation and defeat. For example, the Archbishop Desmond Tutu accepted the reality of the racist apartheid in South Africa, but he did not accept its inevitability as a way of life. He says the question is not how do we escape it? The question is, how can we use this for something positive? This week, in the snippets of time I have ventured outside our home, I have noticed people not accepting social distancing. Right now, hear me plain, nobody gets to decide for someone else whether they will shake hands or hug or stand close to someone else in line. This is life and death. There's a mixed message even when Dr. Fauci is standing shoulder to shoulder with the others in those press conferences. But to accept this challenge and to emerge from it, we have to think and we have to distance. Perhaps you are discouraged that leaders and celebrities, most of them super wealthy, don't have to accept the same reality as the rest of us. And frankly, some of them wouldn't be able to tell the difference between accountability and SpongeBob SquarePants. Perhaps you are as troubled as I am over the scapegoating happening to our Chinese descendants living in our midst. As a gay man, I am part of a group often scapegoated and blamed for quite a number of things. Viruses, a few. Hurricanes, floods, crash of the stock market. So I am especially scandalized when the President of the United States calls the coronavirus a Chinese virus. Viruses do not know and they do not care about things like nationalities or ancestry or political re-election campaigns. So I accept that the President is like that. But as a person of faith, and as people of faith, we must stand up for the gospel of Jesus Christ, the inclusive gospel of unconditional love. And we must speak out against race baiting whenever it happens. How can we use this as something positive? Well, Jesus is our example. So be like Jesus. That is the sermon. Thank you. Do not be like the Pharisees in today's reading you are about to hear. In John 9, we're going to hear the whole chapter. It's a story of Jesus healing a blind person. Of this story, Richard Lisher writes, "The story of this cure takes exactly 2 verses. The controversy surrounding the cure, 39. The calendar changes, the years roll on, but human nature is pretty much the same. Unaccountable authorities sink to the oldest of all debate tactics, and you will hear it in this reading. Assail the source of your opponent. Call it a hoax. Ask antagonistic questions. Where did this rabbi get his education? Why should we accept someone who breaks with tradition so boldly? Is he even allowed to be up in here?" This is a song about that same rabbi who was a rabble rouser. I hope that as you hear it, you will decide to sing along at the end. The words are in the online program. He had no wife, no family. He had no children of his own. He once had been a refugee, despised but never left alone. To all the widowed and the fatherless, he showed a love that none had shown. He liked to watch as children played. He knew the lyrics of their song. He cared for those who lived at risk, the ones whose rights had all gone wrong. The plight of helpless and of homeless folk would always in his heart belong. He had no job to pay the rent, but women gave him house and food. They saw in him no hidden threats. His singleness was safe and good. And those who no one ever listened to discovered that he understood.
As Victor said, our scripture reading today is John's Gospel, chapter 9, the entire chapter. I'll begin with verses 1 through 17, and I'm reading from the Inclusive Bible. As Jesus walked along, he saw someone who had been blind since birth. The disciples asked Jesus, "Rabbi, was it this individual's sin that caused blindness, or that of the parents?" "Neither," answered Jesus. "It wasn't because of anyone's sin, not this person's nor the parents'. Rather, it was to let God's works shine forth in this person. We must do the deeds of the one who sent me while it is still day, for night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." With that, Jesus spat on the ground, made mud with his saliva, and smeared the blind one's eyes with mud. Then Jesus said, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." Siloam means sent. So the person went off to wash and came back able to see. Neighbors of those who had been accustomed to seeing the blind beggar began to ask, "Isn't this the one who used to sit and beg?" Some said yes, others said no. The one who had been healed simply looked like the beggar. But the individual in question said, "No, it was me." The people then asked, "Then how were your eyes opened?" The answer came, "The one they call Jesus made mud and smeared it in my eyes and told me to go to Siloam to wash. When I went and washed, I was able to see." "Where is Jesus?" they asked. The person replied, "I have no idea." They took the one who had been born blind to the Pharisees. It had been on a Sabbath that Jesus had made the mud paste and opened this one's eyes. The Pharisees asked how the individual could see. They were told, "Jesus put mud on my eyes, I washed it off, and now I can see." This prompted some of the Pharisees to say, "This Jesus cannot be from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath." Others argued, "But how could a sinner perform signs like these?" They were sharply divided. Then they addressed the blind person again. "Since it was your eyes he opened, what do you have to say about this Jesus?" "He's a prophet," came the reply. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Oh
The story continues at John chapter 9, verses 18 through 41. The temple authorities refused to believe that this one had been blind and had begun to see, until they summoned his parents. "Is this your child?" they asked. "And if so, do you attest that your child was blind at birth? How do you account for the fact that now your child can see?" The parents answered, "We know this is our child, blind from birth, but how our child can see or who opened those blind eyes, we have no idea. But don't ask us. Our child is old enough to speak without us." The parents answered this way because they were afraid of the temple authorities, who had already agreed among themselves that anyone who acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why they said, "Our child is of age and should be asked directly." A second time they summoned the one who had been born blind and said, "Give God the glory instead. We know that this Jesus is a sinner." "I don't know whether he is a sinner or not," the individual answered. "All I know is that I used to be blind and now I can see." They persisted. "Just what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" "I already told you, but you won't listen to me," came the answer. "Why do you want to hear it all over again? Don't tell me you want to be disciples of Jesus too." They retorted scornfully, "You're the one who is Jesus' disciple. We're disciples of Moses. We know God spoke through Moses, but we have no idea where this Jesus came from." The others retorted, "Well, this is news. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God doesn't hear sinners, but that if people are devout and obey God's will, God listens to them. It is unheard of that anyone ever gave sight to a person blind from birth. If this one were not from God, he could never have done such a thing." "What?" they exclaimed. "You're steeped in sin from birth, and you're giving us lectures?" With that, they threw the person out. When Jesus heard about the expulsion, he sought out the healed one and asked, "Do you believe in the chosen one?" The other answered, "Who is the one that I may believe?" "You're looking at him," Jesus replied. "The chosen one is speaking to you now." The healed one said, "Yes, I believe," and worshiped Jesus. And Jesus said, "I came into this world to execute justice, to make the sightless see and the seeing blind." Some of the Pharisees who were nearby heard this and said, "You're not calling us blind, are you?" To which Jesus replied, "If you were blind, there would be no sin in that. But since you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I have learned more about acceptance from living with a blind man for 20 years than I could ever express. I don't mean that I have to accept his blindness. That's not what I mean at all. I mean, I have learned about the way he accepts his blindness, how he makes something positive of it. My husband, Lou Grosso, became blind about 26 years ago. When we first met, he used to have approximately one breakdown per week that began with, "I hate being blind, I hate being blind, I hate being blind." He doesn't do that anymore. Much. He uses his blindness as something positive. That is the spiritual practice of acceptance. This may sound strange, but if you want something proofread accurately, give it to a blind person. With his computer's audible screen reader, Lou finds mistakes everyone else misses. What's more, when we watch Netflix, we select the audio description option, English AD is what it's called, and this lovely human voice comes on and describes everything that's happening, often telling us things people with normal abilities, air quotes, would completely miss. Unfazed by visual images, Lou remembers details better than the average bear. Often when people greet Lou saying, "It's nice to see you," they recoil and apologize. But Lou says, "Good to see you too." He always says that, and he sees you, believe me, he sees more than you think. Blind people see a lot more than we give them credit for, like where the bus stop has been relocated, or where I have hidden the Oreos. The French resistance activist Jacques Lucéron lost his sight as a child, the age of 7. As a teenager, he organized against the fascism of Hitler, handing out leaflets on trains, and by the age of 19, he was arrested by the Gestapo. Lucéron wrote, "The seeing do not believe in the blind." All those Bible stories about blind people begging Jesus for healing, they were written by people who can see. The healing Jesus offers in John 9, I think, is akin to the healing he offers in chapter 4 to the woman at the well. Jesus accepts her, gives her living water. It's a metaphor, living water, so that she never thirsts again. Like Lucéron and like Luke, the blind person in this story receives the gift of acceptance and learns that he can now perceive things he could have never known while distracted by appearances. In the book Learning to Walk in the Dark, Barbara Brown Taylor examines the story of Jacques Lucéron and realizes through spiritual practices how we use our common senses for speed and for quick judgment. Although speedy judgment was necessary early on in our evolution, it is now the enemy of progress. She writes, "Our eyes glide so quickly over things that we do not properly attend to. Fingers do not glide," Lucéron points out. To feel a table is a much more intimate activity than seeing it. Run your hands across the top, and you can find that slight dip in the middle of the center. You might otherwise have missed it. It's proof that that table was planed by hand. After that, your fingers work in inches instead of feet, counting the panels by finding the edges and the cracks that separate them, locating a burn sickle-shaped like the bottom of an iron, and a large burr as well. You can smell candle wax before you find it, noting the dents here and there left by diners who brought down their silverware too hard. By the time you reach the legs, you know things about this table that someone who merely glances at it will never know. She concludes, "If this does not sound particularly spiritual to you, it may have more to do with you than with the table." Every major spiritual tradition in the world has something significant to say about the importance of paying attention. "Look at the birds of the air," Jesus said. "Consider the lilies of the field. If you do not have time to pay attention to an ordinary table, how will you ever have the time to pay attention to the Spirit, which is calling you into wholeness, which is trying to repair this world?" Jesus says, "I am the light of the world." This is a spiritual light that transcends waves and particles. a kind of light that moves inside us and shows us things that we would otherwise miss, things like ourselves. Common seeing eyes can only view things superficially. The outer appearance of this pandemic is shocking and terrifying. Fine, I accept that. Now, how will we, as people of faith, look deeper? How do we make something positive of it? In the final verses of chapter 9, Jesus puts it starkly, saying, I came into this world to do justice, to make the sightless see and the seeing blind. There he goes again. To make the blind see and the seeing blind. We leave out this part every way we can. When we accept our blindness, all of our blindnesses, as a spiritual practice, we have to feel our way, and we learn that the road to death is paved with snap judgments and glancing only at the surface of things, really important things, like how do we love our neighbors in a pandemic? How do we stay safe, and safe for the sake of others in a pandemic? We learn what a virus really is and how we will understand this pandemic as an opportunity for love and for acceptance. May God grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference.